the American Enterprise Institute. And he wrote this piece for the New York Times that folds into a new book that he has out, A Time to Build. How did Americans lose faith in everything, is the question he asks. And this is about the disintegration of the legitimacy of so many of our civic institutions that form the bedrock of our free society. He says the question that we do not ask as much as we need to, and we meaning like all of us in our various roles within some of these organizing institutions, schools, law enforcement, academia, the arts, obviously the military. The question, given my role here, how should I behave? That's what people who take an institution they're involved with seriously would ask. As a president or a member of Congress, a teacher or a scientist, a lawyer, a doctor, a pastor or a member, a parent or a neighbor, what should I do here? That's the question he suggests that we're not asking enough, and we need to if we want to restore these institutions, perhaps become a little bit less polarized and, have a little bit more comity among the body populace. For more on this topic, pleased to be joined by Yuval Levin. Again, his book, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. Yuval Levin, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So I like the question, given my role here, how should I behave? It sort of commands a kind of thoughtfulness and self-restraint that is generally lacking. But first diagnose the larger problem that I'm sort of insinuating, what our institutions have become versus what they need to be.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. This is really, it's a book about the problems that our country faces that run deeper than ideology, that run to the core of our culture, our politics, our national identity. And they're problems that are rooted in failures of responsibility, so that at the top of so many of our institutions, we think naturally of politics, but as you say, also in the professions, in education, and even in American civic life, religion, elsewhere, we find people who are using institutions as platforms to get prominence, to perform, to be seen and heard, rather than thinking of institutions as being formative of them, as giving them a certain responsibility, providing them with certain obligations that they have to meet, so that rather than asking, given that I have this position, this responsibility, what should I do here? They're using the position, the responsibility, to gain prominence in the big culture war fights that are sort of the national entertainment these days. And I think that recovering some idea of what institutional obligations are and what they ought to mean to us could help us to turn the temperature down on those fights. They don't go away, they're important, they matter. But if we first see that we owe one another something, then it becomes a little easier to understand how it is that we're supposed to live together in a society that so often is divided.
So does that mean a little bit more focus on the micro, sort of where you live versus the macro?
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Absolutely. Our life should be much more bottom up than top down. It's not I'll tell you something. I live in Maryland. Local elections here for our county council very often now revolve around what you think of Donald Trump. And that's crazy, right? That's a completely upside down way to think about what the responsibility of our local officials are. If you begin from the bottom, if you begin by saying, we have these problems in common, we need to think about them together, here's what I would do, here's what you would do, then I think not only local government and not only national government, but a lot of what we do together in different institutions could function a little better. Rather than thinking this is a way to have the big national argument, we can think this is a way to address the immediate, direct, interpersonal problem that we might be able to help with here.
Is there a sequencing that needs to be at play here? In other words, you need to rehabilitate one institution in order to rehabilitate the others. For example, family or faith as a predicate to some of these other institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, that's exactly where I was going to start, because I think there is no alternative to a recommitment to family and religion and local community. Certainly that's where things start, because those really are interpersonal. We see each other face to face. It's much harder in those situations to believe that we're just talking to sort of abstract, left or right people that we can define away. And so it is in those communities that are local and interpersonal that we might begin to address the kinds of problems we have and build up. But at the same time, our larger institutions also consist of people who do work with each other face to face, who do interact. If members of Congress thought of each other as colleagues working together more than thinking of each other as people on a stage performing for an outside audience that's far away and watching them on YouTube or on Twitter, those institutions would work better too. But I think there's no alternative to understanding our country's strength as working from the bottom up, from strong families and communities first.
It seems that we have a fundamental philosophical problem in that both political parties sort of operate in different ways, but operate on the premise that we're here to maximize liberty. This is all freedom, and it's freedom from everything. It's sort of treating liberty as a synonym with libertine. You see this in bipartisan support for things like marijuana legalization. And so, if you're to be if you're to be the atomized individual who's unrestrained from everything, then how can you then be persuaded to be part of these platoons of democracy that these organizing institutions?
I think you're exactly right, and it's part of why in this book I try to use this term institutions and the concept of the institution to think about the kinds of problems we have, because ultimately our institutions are formative. From family on up, they form us in order to be able to be free. The idea that we can just be liberated and then everything will be fine is a mistake, I think, about human nature. It's a very deep mistake. Ultimately, we need first to be formed so that we can be free responsibly. And that's what we need to expect of our institutions, which means our politics, and not only our politics, needs to be about much more than just liberty. It needs to be about forming human beings in a way that can make us responsible and capable of liberty. And it also needs to be about unity and solidarity, about ways of drawing us together to address problems we have in common. Our politics can do that. It's capable of it. But as you say, the language we have for our political life now so often is so thin and shallow that it is just about a kind of leave me alone idea of liberty that just isn't up to the challenge. It's not enough. It's not what liberty even really means. And a recovery of that, I think, has to begin with a recovery of institutional responsibility.
And does that recovery come from perhaps some that had previously enjoyed expert status, some who had fancied themselves part of some vanguard class, exercising a bit of humility to say, you know what, we were wrong. We understand why this institution lost some legitimacy in at least a portion of the public's mind, and we want to involve so as to reform and reintroduce, whether that's schools or churches or anything else.
That's right. I think that people have to see that their institutional roles are fundamentally modes of responsibility, so that rather than just empowering them to have their way or whatever they want because they're the experts, it actually imposes obligations on them, and it imposes certain ways of making decisions and reaching judgments, whether that's through the professions, which are essential institutions in our society, whether it's through modes of giving people the confidence of a larger public in their expertise. The reason we trust experts is because we believe that they are subject to rules and obligations and ultimately a set of responsibilities. If they behave as though that's not true, they shouldn't be surprised that their expertise loses its force and power. So that has to begin by a recovery of that sense of responsibility, first and foremost.
I was struck last week, and we talked about it on our show, by corresponding with the timing of Jim Lehrer's passing at the age of 85, the venerable newsman. And circulating online was Jim Lehrer's rules for journalism, the rules that he memorialized that informed how he practiced his profession. And there were some that were just that were really journalistic focused, like about using anonymous sources, and then there were others that were just a respect for your audience as well as your subject. You know, treat the subject of your piece the way you would want to be treated if you were the subject of this piece. Just simple things like that. It seems like a lot of these institutions you're talking about generally could use that sort of rebranding exercise, establishing what the first principles of these institutions are and publishing them and saying to everybody, we're going to hold ourselves to these principles, that's what we want our brand to be, and we're going to work towards living these principles so people understand it to be our brand?
I think it's absolutely right. The journalism is a great example. Journalism is a profession. It's a profession that when it's respected because its members abide by certain rules. They subject themselves to a process of verification and confirmation. They only say what they know. They help the people who are listening to them understand the difference between what they know and what they don't. When journalists take themselves out of that process, take themselves out of the institutions that actually empower them with any authority, and just put themselves out as individuals on Twitter, expressing their opinion in an open kind of unformed conversation, they make it impossible for us to know when to trust them and why to trust them. And those kinds of rules that Jim Lehrer articulated and that a lot of traditional journalists try to live by, which you might say are implicit in their work when they're doing them well, those kinds of rules have gone by the wayside in a lot of journalistic institutions. And the public now has real trouble trusting journalists. In order to recover that, I do think that journalism and other professions are like this too, have to make explicit the rules they live by, the limits they have, the obligations that they impose on their members, and help the public see why they should be trusted. It's interesting. The one exception to the loss of confidence in institutions in America is the military. And I think the reason for that is not just that the military is very good at protecting the country, though it is, but because we know, we truly believe that the military forms men and women to be responsible, that it helps people internalize a set of responsibilities and obligations that they then take very, very seriously in their lives. That's how an institution builds confidence and ultimately gains the public's trust.
He is Yuval Levin. He's the director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute, the editor of National Affairs, former member of the White House domestic policy staff under George W. Bush, and his book, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. Yuval, thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with the book. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit Signature